The call came on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. While I was standing at my kitchen counter, layering sliced apples into a pie dish I'd owned since before my son was born. I know it was exactly 9:47 because I'd set a timer on my oven for the pastry resting in the refrigerator, and I watched 3 minutes tick off the clock while he talked. He said Carla had found a resort deal up in the Berkshires. He said their friends had been talking about it for months. He said it would be good for the whole family to get away, and that he was sorry about the timing. But I understood, didn't I? I always understood. I set down the knife I'd been using. The apples sat in the dish, half arranged, already going soft at the edges. I said, "I see," and I hung up. The dining room was set for 7. I'd pulled the extended leaf out of the table myself on Monday, dragging it in from the closet by my bedroom, where it lived the rest of the year, scraping it across the hardwood until my lower back complained. I'd ironed the cream linen tablecloth the night before. I'd hand-lettered the name cards with a calligraphy pen I'd ordered online 3 weeks prior, watching tutorial videos at my kitchen table until I got the loops the way I wanted. Ryan's card sat at the head of the table, Carla's beside it, and then the 2 place settings I'd arranged carefully for my grandsons, with a small turkey sticker on Tyler's card that I'd thought the 10-year-old might get a kick out of. I stood in the doorway of the dining room for a moment, looking at all of it. The folded napkins, the water glasses, the small ceramic leaf I'd found at a shop downtown and placed in the center of the table because it was pretty, because I'd thought it would add something. I hadn't set a table for 7 for myself. I walked to the window that faced the driveway. The yard was the way Western Massachusetts gets in late November. Stripped bare, ground gone hard, the oak in the front holding on to its last few curled leaves as if by stubbornness alone. Doverfield had been my town for 31 years, since Ryan's father was still alive, since this house had been full of the right kind of noise. I'd raised my son here. I'd made every Thanksgiving in this kitchen since 1993. I sat down at the kitchen table and let the silence settle. After a while, I picked up my phone. Carla's Instagram was public. I'd never followed her, but I'd looked once or twice in the past. A mother does what a mother does. The first story was already up. A video of a resort lobby. Vaulted ceilings, a fireplace built for a cathedral, pine garlands draped across the beams like something out of a magazine. Carla's voice in the background saying, "Oh my God, it's gorgeous." Then a pan to my son, grinning, holding up a cocktail in one of those stemmed resort glasses, looking relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Then Tyler shrieking and running toward the elevator, and Jamie behind him, with his hands deep in his hoodie pocket, not quite smiling. The caption read, "Grateful for spontaneous adventures and the people who make them happen." Spontaneous. That's what she'd called it. I watched it twice. Then I put the phone face down on the table and sat without moving for a long time. 2 weeks ago, Ryan had called me. Not about Thanksgiving, about money. He and Carla were stretched thin that month, he'd said. There was a thing with friends, a trip, a resort. The deposit was due before the deal expired. Would I co-sign a short-term personal loan through his credit union? Just to bridge the gap. He'd pay it back by January. I hadn't asked for details. I signed the papers the same afternoon he emailed them. I went to the hall closet and pulled out the plastic crate where I kept my household records. I sat cross-legged on the floor with the folders spread around me. The cosign document was near the top. $4,200 for the Berkshires resort, for the spontaneous adventure, for the trip my son was currently on, while I sat on the floor of my own hallway in a house that smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, and 5 days of careful preparation. I kept going through the folders, old bank statements, checks with handwritten notes clipped to them, wire transfer confirmations. It took me a long time. The light outside shifted while I sat there, going from thin gray morning light to the flat white of midday. The number at the bottom of the page, when I finally tallied everything, was $109,000. Over 15 years, given in increments small enough that none of them had felt serious in the moment. Given with love, I'd always told myself, given, because that's what you do for your children, even when they're grown, even when they're 41. And married with their own house and their own income and their own reasons for needing one more bridge to cross before they could stand on their own feet. I sat on the floor for a while after that. The house was cold. I'd let the heat drop while I was sitting there, and I hadn't noticed. I put the folders back in the crate and returned it to the closet. Then I went to the phone. The customer service line picked up after 3 rings. A young man with a steady voice walked me through the verification. I gave him my account number and the last 4 of my social security number and told him what I needed. I wanted to cancel all automatic transfers to my son's accounts. The monthly mortgage contribution I'd been making since Carla's second maternity leave nearly 4 years ago. The recurring deposit toward the boys' school fees. The credit card I'd added myself to as a secondary payer when their consolidation application had been turned down. And I wanted to formally flag my intent to remove my name from the cosign on the personal loan. I understood that would require additional steps, but I wanted it on record that evening. He was thorough and professional. He told me some things could be done immediately, and some would require an in-branch visit. He placed holds on everything else. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in the kitchen. Outside, the driveway was still empty. It had been empty all day. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry in any way that burned. What I felt was closer to the sensation of putting down something you've been carrying for so long you stopped noticing the weight. Not relief, exactly. Just the sudden absence of pressure. The next morning I woke up early. The turkey had been sitting in the refrigerator overnight, covered in foil, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at it before I made a decision. I called the Doverfield Community Center, where I'd volunteered a few years back. A woman named Clara answered, efficient and warm. I asked if they were running a Thanksgiving meal service that day and whether they could use a food donation. She said yes, and God bless you, and could I have it there by 11? I packed up the turkey, the stuffing, the cranberry relish I'd made from scratch, with orange zest the way my late mother used to make it, and the 2 pies. I drove them over in 2 trips from the car to the service entrance. Clara met me at the door in a yellow apron with maple leaf earrings, the exact right earrings, for someone running a community Thanksgiving at 7 in the morning. She thanked me 4 times and asked if I'd ever want to come back and volunteer. I said I would think about it seriously, and I meant it. On the drive home, I noticed something. The feeling that had been sitting in my chest like a stone for the past 2 days. It hadn't lifted exactly, but it had shifted. The food I'd made was still feeding people, just different ones. I'd given it on my own terms, to strangers who hadn't taken anything from me, and they'd said thank you like they meant it. That was something, small, but something. In the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I assumed it was a delivery. I'd ordered a fuse recently and wasn't keeping track. But when I opened the door, Jamie was standing on my front porch with his backpack and his hands buried in his coat pockets, cheeks red from the cold. "Hey, Grandma," he said. I looked at him. He was 17, taller than he'd been at summer, still wearing that particular teenage slouch that I knew would straighten out in a few years. He was looking at me with an expression doing its best to pass itself off as casual. "How did you get here?" I asked. "Bus from Springfield." Then I walked from the stop on Elm. He gestured vaguely down the street. "It's not far. It's 31 degrees. "I have a coat," he said, as though this settled the matter. I opened the door wider and stepped aside. He walked in carefully, the way you walk into a space when you're trying to read what happened there before you arrived. He looked at the dining room. I'd removed the extra chairs and refolded the tablecloth, but the table was still extended, still set for 4. Still covered in cream linen. He looked at the kitchen. Then, he looked at me. "They didn't come," he said. "No." He set his backpack down by the door. "Dad told us in the car that we were going to the resort instead of here. He said you'd be fine with it, that you'd understand." He paused. I didn't want to go. I told them I wasn't feeling well and that I'd get the bus. "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged in the way teenagers shrug when they've actually made a considered decision, but don't want to seem like they have. "I wanted to see you." We made tea. He wrapped his hands around the mug the way he had since he was smalls, when the mugs were too big for him and he'd needed both hands just to lift one. We sat at the kitchen table, and the quiet between us was comfortable, the kind you only get with someone you've known long enough to not need to fill. After a while, he said, "Dad said you're always fine." I turned my mug slowly on the table. I know he did. But you weren't, were you? I looked at him. 17 and already understanding something a lot of people in their 40s hadn't figured out. I thought about lying, or softening it, the way I always did. And then I thought, he came here on a bus in November to find out the truth. He deserved to hear it. No, I said, I wasn't. He nodded slowly. Then he asked if the calligraphy pen on the counter was mine. I said it was, that I'd bought it for the name cards. He asked if I'd teach him. We spent the next hour at the kitchen table, practicing letters on the back of a paper grocery bag, his tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in concentration, his handwriting going from shaky to deliberate as he got the feel of the pressure. When I drove him to the bus stop at dusk, he hugged me on the sidewalk for a long moment, longer than usual. I held on. After his bus disappeared down the road, I sat in my car in the cold for a while before driving home. Someone had seen the table. Someone had come anyway. Not because they needed anything, just because they'd looked up and thought of me. That mattered. It was going to keep mattering. The next morning, I drove to my attorney's office. Hugo had been my lawyer since my husband passed, since the estate had needed sorting and I'd been too newly widowed to trust my own judgment on anything that had numbers attached. He was methodical and quiet and had never once made me feel like my concerns were small. I sat across from him and told him what I wanted. I wanted my son removed as primary beneficiary from the liquid assets. I wanted an educational trust established for both grandsons, with my oversight while I lived and a neutral trustee named for after. I wanted the house formally documented in a way that made it impossible for anyone to leverage or pressure me to sell it, regardless of family relationship. And I wanted Jamie designated as a named beneficiary with a separate protected account in his name, starting now, not later, while I was still here to see it matter. Hugo listened with his pen resting on the pad, not writing yet, just taking it in. When I finished, he said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "A few days," I said, "but I think I've been getting ready for a while." He nodded. He picked up his pen. We went through each section. I signed wherever he directed, cleanly and without hesitation. When he handed me the finalized copies at the end of the meeting, the papers were precise and ordered. My name, my intentions, witnessed and notarized and beyond argument. Walking back to my car in the cold gray light, I tried to name what I was feeling. It wasn't lightness. It wasn't the particular relief of escaping something. It was more like the feeling of standing up straight after years of leaning slightly forward without realizing it, carrying a weight so constant, you'd mistaken it for just the way you stood. Ryan called 3 days later. I let it ring twice before picking up. His voice was careful. Not warm, not angry, just careful, the same tone as the call that had started all of this. He said the bank had notified him about the account changes. He said Carla had questions. He said he just wanted to understand what was happening. "Nothing is happening," I said. "I made some adjustments." "Mom, the mortgage supplement is something you'll need to manage on your own now," I said, "as you should have been for some time." Silence then. "Are you punishing us?" I thought about that for a moment. Honestly, the way I'd been trying to do everything since Wednesday. "No," I said. "I'm just done being optional." He came to see me on a Sunday alone. Carla didn't come. Some conversations happen better without an audience, and I think on some level he knew that. He sat at my kitchen table, the same chairs, the bare oak through the window, and for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, he looked at me without looking past me. Not through me at whatever was next on his calendar. At me. "I didn't think about what I was asking you to sign," he said. He meant the loan. I should have. "You were thinking about the trip." "Yeah," he rubbed the back of his neck. "That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "We've relied on you too much." It was a small sentence. It didn't undo 15 years, but it was honest. And he said it without any of the usual hedging, without the gentle pivot toward why things had gotten this way and whose fault that really was. He just said it and let it sit. I looked out at the oak tree. A cardinal had landed on one of the high branches, that startling red against the gray, holding still for a moment before the wind moved, and it was gone. You have, I said, and I let you. I kept telling myself I was helping because I loved you. Maybe that was true. But somewhere along the way, I stopped counting myself into the equation. I stopped expecting to matter outside of what I could provide. He looked down at the table. You do matter. I know that now, I said. That's what changed. He stayed for about an hour. We didn't repair everything. That's not what one Sunday afternoon is for. And I wasn't looking for a dramatic resolution. What I wanted was simpler than that. For him to understand that I was still here, still his mother, still someone who loved him, but that the version of me who signed papers without asking questions, who said of course, and don't worry and I understand at every turn, was not coming back. That wasn't punishment. It was just the truth. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door with his hand on the frame. Jamie told me he took the bus out to see you, he said, on Thanksgiving. He did. He was quiet for a moment. He said it was the best part of his holiday. He swallowed once. I'm sorry it wasn't us. I held his gaze. I'm sorry it wasn't either, I said, but I'm glad it was him. After he left, I stood at the window for a while. The driveway, empty now the way it had been on Thanksgiving morning, looked different to me than it had then. Less like an absence and more like space. Space I was deciding what to do with, for the first time in a long time. That evening, I wrote Jamie a letter. Nothing long, just a page and a half on the good stationery, the kind with the small blue border I saved for things that needed to last. I told him his calligraphy was already better than mine had been at his age, which was true. I told him I was doing well and that the community center had called to ask if I wanted to volunteer on Christmas Eve, and I was considering it. And then I wrote what I'd been thinking about since the afternoon he'd stood on my porch in the cold and said, simply, I wanted to see you. I told him that showing up for someone is not a small thing, that most people find reasons not to, that the ones who don't, who get on the bus anyway, who walk the mile in 30-degree weather, who sit at the kitchen table and learn calligraphy on a paper bag. Those are the people who end up mattering most in a life. That he should know that about himself, that he was already that kind of person, and he should protect it. I sealed the envelope and left it by the door to mail in the morning. Then I made myself dinner, the first real meal I'd cooked for just myself, and I didn't know how long, and I ate it at the kitchen table with a book propped open against the sugar bowl. And outside the window, the street was quiet and the cold had settled in properly, the way it does in November in New England when it means to stay. The house was still, but it was my stillness, not an absence. There's a difference, and I was only now learning to tell them apart. You spend so many years being the person everyone can count on that it starts to feel like a personality, like the whole of who you are, the one who sets the table, the one who makes the food, the one who signs without reading carefully and says yes, because that's what love looks like, isn't it? Making things easier for the people you made. But somewhere underneath all of that, there is a woman who existed before she was anyone's mother, who had her own name on her own paperwork, her own reasons for things, her own calendar that didn't organize itself around everyone else's needs. She didn't disappear. She was just quieter than everything else for a very long time. And she was still here, still setting her own table, this time just for herself.